Good afternoon, everybody. This is Stephen Russell with the San Diego Housing Federation, and it looks like people are piling into the room here. We're up to 75 people. I think we're expecting 120 or so. I'm going to speak for a few minutes before we actually start the program formally, just to allow people time to log in, and people are doing it pretty rapidly right now, which is great. One thing I really want to encourage you to use the chat function. It's a good way of letting either the organizers or the other members of the audience know what's on your mind if you have a question. The questions go only to the administrators, and so if you have something you'd like to ask of the staff here, just use the question function, and we will see that. A couple things before we start. We'll probably start properly about 5 minutes past the hour. I hear the church bells, meaning it is 1 o'clock straight up right now. A few announcements I would like to make, if I may. The Ruby Awards, which is the signature event of the San Diego Housing Federation, where we recognize some of the best of the best, we like to say, in the affordable housing sector. Normally, of course, in a live awards program. This year we'll be streaming it on July 23rd from 3 to 5 p.m. It's free, and we'd encourage you, if you want to learn more about what some of your colleagues are doing in the affordable housing space. Again, it will be free on July 23rd, 3 to 5 p.m. And just go on the website for the San Diego Housing Federation to get more information. That's housingsandiego.org. We also have our annual conference coming up. It's going to be virtual as well. Some folks are making ambitious plans for live events in the fall. We're taking a more cautious approach and want to make sure that everybody can be included. So we will have our conference the 5th to 9th of October, and someone asked, so from 5th to 9th of October, and we will be accepting workshop proposals. So hello, everybody. Got my camera going now. We'll start properly again in a few minutes. But let me talk about the conference. It will be a virtual event. We're designing it as such. We're taking workshop proposals right now that are due June 12th. So if anybody has an idea they'd like to see presented at the conference, the workshop proposals aren't a very onerous process. It's a page that describes the idea of what you'd like to do. And again, if you go to housingsandiego.org, you can see the form and you can get all the information you need. Just look under events, and we'd really appreciate everybody being a part of that. The conference, because it's online, will be much more affordable. And so we have enormous capacity. I think it's over 1,000 capacity, and we're hoping to see a lot of you folks there. Again, when I'm just watching the clock, we want to make sure people have time to clock in. We've got about 99 of our 120 people there. So we'll give it one more minute or two. And really pleased to be here today, though. This is our first, and I appreciate everyone's patience today. This is the first conference we've hosted in this format. A lot of rehearsals gone into this. I really want to call out Raquel Herati, who is on staff of San Diego Housing Federation, although she's leaving us to go to her pursue her passion at the University of North Carolina soon. But she's been amazing, absolute demon, doing all the work to pull this together and helping us all learn, because we're going to be doing a lot more of these kinds of events and really want to see what we can do to make these events most successful. So at the end of the session today, there is going to be an opportunity for, in fact, when you log out of GoToWebinar, there's automatically a survey generated that we ask you if you can give us the feedback as to what you'd like to see. Not just at our conference, we talk with our colleagues and we work together, and we want to bring the highest quality of streaming education that we can and make it as interactive as possible. So I'm looking at 104. Let me go ahead and start with, I'm going to scroll to the beginning of the program here. We will get this started. And first off, I think the important thing, is to say welcome. So good afternoon, and welcome to the San Diego Regional Alliance for Fair Housing Conference. Once again, my name is Stephen Russell. I'm the Executive Director for the San Diego Housing Federation. So we do want to do a few housekeeping notes. First off, managing your audio. Telephoning in is recommended. You often get the best, clearest reception, and we hear you the best as well. And if you are having trouble hearing the audio on your computer, try the telephone line. questions. So we're going to ask you to use the question function. Type in your questions while the speaker is speaking. There's a moderator that is working with each of the speakers who is going to be monitoring the questions. And indicate when you write your question whether you'd like to ask it yourself or whether you'd like the moderator to actually ask the question for you. And if you haven't already downloaded the agenda, there is a handout section on your screen where you can pull out the agenda and you can see what that looks like. But again, with questions, use the question function. Let us know that you'd like to ask something. We also encourage use of the chat function. You can select the audience members through the chat function and connect directly with folks. It's a good way to keep it interactive. What else do we have here? There's a web survey. I think I said that earlier, that there's we'll ask for your opinion, how we can make these programs better, more responsive. And I think a lot of us are doing a lot of these kinds of programs these days, and we want to collectively raise the bar and make these as interesting and dynamic as possible. Oh, very important, I want to thank our sponsors, the San Diego Regional Alliance for Fair Housing, the key sponsor for this event, working together with the San Diego Housing Federation, Pacific Western Bank, LISC San Diego, and the California Housing Finance Agency. Thank you very much to our sponsors that make this possible, and we appreciate the support of everybody involved. I also want to thank very much the committee members who put this together. They're all in your program. I'll tell you just to go there rather than read a long list. There's a lot of folks who worked very hard to make today possible, and they deserve our sincere thanks. Let's see here. And okay. Press enter instead of clicking. So I'm getting instructions via text as I'm talking to you folks here as well. So, and let's see here. So yes, absolutely. Please join the conversation on social media. If you use these hashtags here, SDRAFF 2020 and FH Digital Age, Fair Housing in the Digital Age, to join us in discussing the material covered today. We really want to use this to raise awareness, not just amongst ourselves, but also amongst our friends and colleagues, because we think this is a very, very important topic, fascinating material you're going to see today. So please share the information with your friends, and we'll enjoy that. And with that, welcome. So my welcome is going to be brief. This day really belongs to the San Diego Regional Alliance for Fair Housing, but the San Diego Housing Federation is really pleased to be a part of this. We are a 30-year-old organization. This is our 30th anniversary, dedicated to increasing the supply of housing for folks who are of lower income. Typically, for those of you who work in almost all of you, 80% AMI and below. Most of that housing is tax credit subsidized, but there's other ways of getting affordable housing produced as well, and we work on all of those. We also are deeply committed to the notion that everyone ought to have decent housing available. And making that available means, of course, that the rule of law applies, that people are treated fairly, and that the opportunities that are out there for housing are available to everybody. So we're really pleased to be a part of this. This is the 4th year we've done this as a partnership with San Diego Regional Alliance for Fair Housing. Very, very excited to be doing this, and challenged a little bit by this new format, but really pleased that you can all be here to join us. As it stands right now, we have 121 people here, so thank you for being here. With that, I would like to welcome our co-presenter, if you will. I'd like to introduce Estela de los Rios, the Executive Director of the Center for Social Advocates and President of the San Diego Regional Alliance for Fair Housing, here to say a few welcoming words. So with that,
Thank
Estela,
you, Stephen.
I hand it to you.
Thank you. Welcome. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you to each and every one of you for being here with us today. We're very pleased to be able to welcome those of you that have been with us before, as well as those that are new to our conference. More than 50 years after the Modern Civil Rights Act and the Fair Housing Act, racial discrimination still persists in the United States. It's stubbornly pervasive in employment, housing, credit, and consumer markets. With the emergence and development of internet and big data, individuals' daily life is increasingly affected by algorithms. From listening to the radio, watching movies, to shopping, socializing, almost all activities acting on mobile media are monitored, collected, and analyzed by algorithms. To this day, there's no obvious method to adjust historical data to rid it of this taint. The world of science and academia is no exception to the ever-expanding regimen of algorithms. On our phones, tablets, other devices in our digital world, algorithms hail our Uber rides, decide who we choose to befriend on social media, and choose shows, movies, and products for us to consume. Algorithms rule our world by organizing, making sense of data for us. Data is frequently imperfect in ways that allow these algorithms to inherit the prejudices of prior decision makers. Today's conference will examine, explore, and focus on the future of how algorithms stand to impact fair housing. San Diego Regional Alliance on Fair Housing is honored to have a list of prominent speakers who will lead the discussion on how algorithms negatively affect fair housing. We welcome and salute Lisa Rice, President and Chief Executive Officer of the National Fair Housing Alliance. Through her determined efforts, Lisa works diligently to eliminate housing discrimination and to ensure equal housing opportunity for all people. I would like to leave you with a quote from Mahatma Gandhi. In a gentle way, you can shake the world. The future depends on what you do today. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Estella, if I may, for letting us co-host this event. We'll jump right to the keynote address with Lisa Rice. She's the president and CEO of the National Fair Housing Alliance, which is the nation's only national civil rights agency solely dedicated to eliminating all forms of housing discrimination. NFHA is also the trade association for over 200 member organizations across the country that work to eliminate barriers in the housing markets and expand equal housing and lending opportunities. NFHA provides a range of programs to affirmatively further fair housing, including community development, neighborhood stabilization, training, education, outreach, advocacy, consulting, and enforcement initiatives. Here to serve as the moderator for this portion is going to be Rosalina Spencer, who's a senior attorney at the Fair Housing Center Legal Aid Society. She'll be monitoring the chat and questions and assisting with questions throughout. So with that, I'd like to welcome Lisa to the stage. Lisa?
Good afternoon. Can everybody hear me? I'm not saying anything, so I'm assuming that folks can hear me. You always have to check to make sure the technology is working.
Sure. I'm hearing you.
Thank you. I want to thank Rosalina and Stephen and Estella and the whole team for inviting me to this Fair Housing Symposium. I really appreciate the invitation. I'm so happy to be here with you all today. It's really a pleasure. I wish I was there in person in sunny San Diego, but we have to make do with what we've got. I'm going to talk a little bit about the intersection between fair housing and technology. I believe we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes at the end of the presentations for Q&A, and I'm really looking forward to that. This is such an important topic because the COVID-19 pandemic and economic crisis are really laying bare the structural inequities that are replete throughout our society and really exposing the systemic issues that are fueling disparate outcomes. Latinos and African Americans are contracting and dying from the coronavirus at much higher rates than the general population, and structural inequality and inequity really lies at the core of that. It also lies at the core of tech bias, which is what we're going to talk about today. Technology is becoming more and more common. We are expanding the use of technology in our marketplace. We are expanding the different sectors in which we are using technologies, and in particular, artificial technology, data-driven technology. So not only are we expanding the sectors where we are using technology, criminal justice, healthcare, food services, rental housing, but we are expanding the use of technology and data-driven technology in particular within each of these sectors. Even though time and again we see across our headlines, even though we see stories across our headlines on a very regular basis about the type of bias that we're all trying to fight and eliminate being perpetuated in these systems. We saw a couple of years ago that Amazon used an artificial intelligence system in order to build a tool to help it select top talent, but had to quickly shut down that system when it discovered that the AI system was discriminating against women and generating gender bias. The computer models that they use for this device, for this tool, were trained to analyze applicants by observing information in resumes that had been used to train the system, but most of those resumes were resumes of men. And so the AI system quickly learned that the top candidates are male and not female, and developed a bias for men and against women, as you would suppose. And in fact, when the system detected that an applicant was a woman, it penalized the applicant and downgraded the applicant. And so obviously the project had to quickly be abandoned. Likewise, we've seen stories in the healthcare sector. It was just announced late last year that a very widely used algorithm in the healthcare system was found to have significant racial bias, favoring white applicants over, white patients over patients of color, even when those patients of color were sicker and had more chronic health conditions. These types of systems are very widely used. In fact, they affect over 200 million patients every single year. They're used by government agencies, they're used by hospitals, they're used by healthcare systems. One of the researchers who uncovered the bias in this system stated, the algorithms end up perpetuating all of the biases that we currently have in our healthcare systems, furthering and entrenching the vicious cycles that we want to break. The algorithm in this particular instance used healthcare costs to predict and rate which patients would benefit the most from additional care. And the thing that I really want to point out about this particular algorithmic system is that the designers of the system purposefully removed racial data. So they cleaned their data set before they built the model. They cleaned the data set of any data that was related to race or that facially was related to race. But what the algorithm didn't account for is the bias that we already know exists in the healthcare system. And instead, it incorporated real-life discrimination into its formula, making the bias more pervasive and systemic. So one of the things that the system heavily relied on was healthcare costs. But the system didn't realize that people of color disproportionately live in health deserts, and that Black patients in particular have far less access to healthcare and therefore spend far less money on healthcare costs. So they didn't understand that a lot of the data that they were using in the system served as either a proxy for race or different data elements in their combination were highly correlated to race and thus generated a discriminatory outcome. We saw the same kind of thing happen last year with Apple, the Apple Card, where customers found that in the same household, a woman who had a higher credit score and the same financial profile in terms of assets, in terms of income and assets, so the same financial profile as her male partner, but a higher credit score was afforded less credit because of the bias that was baked into the algorithm. We see the same thing happen with credit scoring systems. It used to be thought when credit scoring systems first came on the scene that they were race neutral and that they did not generate bias. And what we now know is that these systems are anything but race neutral, and they generate a lot of bias. The bias is embedded within the formulas and the codes that generate the credit scores. In fact, a credit score can actually serve as a proxy for race. So we're seeing story after story about discrimination being perpetuated in all of these technological systems. But oddly enough, we're using technology more. We're not lessening the use of technology, we're expanding the use of technology. And we're even seeing that in the midst of this COVID-19 pandemic, that financial service providers are onboarding new technological systems. They're innovating even more to try and address all of the challenges that are besetting them because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we're seeing a lot of technological innovation in the mortgage servicing space. We're seeing a lot of technical innovation in the origination space, particularly for homeowners who are trying to refi, because those are the businesses that are really ramping up, and people are trying to develop models and systems to address customer demand. So we're seeing an increased use of technology in the financial services space, but unfortunately, the financial services companies that are developing and purchasing these technologies are not realizing the bias that is being generated by their systems. We say that technology is the new civil rights frontier because technology and data are not innocuous. Data is tainted. It is not colorblind. You used to hear very, very often people say, well, computers are colorblind. Data is colorblind. It doesn't see a color. Nothing could be further than the truth. The data sees color. The data sees gender. The data sees other characteristics that are protected classes under our civil rights laws. And so technology can actually amplify and magnify the bias that is already in existence in our society. Why? Because if I am a single individual person and I am interacting with a consumer and I have either intentional bias or explicit bias that is unconscious that I'm not recognizing, I can discriminate against a consumer, but that discrimination is a one-off, really, because I'm just one person and I'm affecting one customer at a time. The danger about bias being embedded and encoded in technological systems is that these technologies, these systems, have the ability to generate decisions much more at a much higher volume, right? So we're exponentially increasing the ability of a system to manifest discrimination. I can manifest discrimination, you know, once per hour or something like that. But a technological system can discriminate against people, a million people per hour, right? Because the power behind these engines is so vast. So technology generates systemic, it recreates, it perpetuates systemic bias that is already existent in our society. So what I want to do is take a step back and look at the fundamentals of structural inequity in the United States and just kind of take you through a very, very short exercise. I don't have enough time to go into detail on all of these slides and discuss them as I really would like, but it'll at least give you a sense and an understanding of why we have structural bias in the United States and what we're really grappling with, the magnitude of the problem, and the magnitude of the solution that we're going to have to put in place in order to address this issue. So if you go back and look at throughout history, so the development of the United States of America, if you go back and look at all of the laws that we used in order to not only develop this nation, but to develop housing and lending policies in what is now considered the United States of America. One thing really stares out at you, and so look at, I just put a smattering of laws. I didn't put all of the laws there, just a few. You don't see any laws related to slavery. You don't see any laws related to the Black codes. So I didn't put the original United States Constitution. So it's just a smattering of laws there to give you an idea and a sense of how this current system and structure was built. So starting out with the head rights system, which of course predated the United States, the head rights system was implemented by the British government when the colonies were established here. The 13 colonies were established in the eastern border of the United States. The head rights system, it was a system for allotting land and helping people to build housing, shelter in this what was called New World. The head rights system afforded 50 to 100 acres of land to every, in most cases, male who was establishing a household, establishing a state in the quote unquote New World. And 50 to 100 acres was based on every person in the household, including slaves. So slavery actually became a system of providing, it became a foundation for providing land wealth for whites who were immigrating to this new world. So people of color were the assets, really, to enrich white people who were coming to this world. Now, the thing that we have to think about is that land, that 50 to 100 acres of land that was being allotted per person in a household to white settlers, that land wasn't free for the taking. That land had to come from somewhere. And it came from the indigenous populations who were already living here. So their land was being encroached upon and taken, seized, to provide wealth for the new settlers who were coming to the United States of America, hence the Indian Removal Act. And in fact, one exercise you might do is just Google Indian Removal Act and look at the images. You'll see advertisements where our government is actually saying, here's an opportunity for you. We've just taken land from Indian peoples and we're going to give it to you. Really a transference of wealth from indigenous populations to white settlers who were coming to the United States. Jim Crow laws, the Homeowners Loan Corporation. Many people have heard about the establishment of the Homeowners Loan Corporation, the Federal Housing Administration, which was set up under the National Housing Act, and how these programs were implemented through a racialized lens. And that's the thing that I really want you to take away from this slide here. Every single law that you see here was implemented through a racialized lens, right? So race was a consideration either in the actual language of the law or in the rules, the guidelines that were developed by federal agencies in order to implement the law. So there were racialized, deliberate racism, right? Deliberate racism in terms of the implementation and the application of these laws and the programs that were set up under these laws. I think everybody already knows, I don't need to go through it in any really detail, about how the Homeowners Loan Corporation systemized, did not create redlining, but systemized redlining in the United States by the development of the residential security maps, which we commonly call the redlining maps. And I think you guys have probably all seen those. If you have not, just Google HOLC and redlining maps, and you will see the maps that the United States federal government generated to code, to value, to evaluate, to place a value on space and place and where people live. It is the Homeowners Loan Corporation, that redlining map system, and the policies that were implemented by the FHA under the National Housing Act that helped to create residential segregation in America. We are more segregated today than we were 100 years ago because of the policies that were implemented by the federal government under these two programs. I'll say that again. We are more racially segregated today than we were 100 years ago. Racial segregation and racial exclusion were the underpinnings of the HOLC program, which was put in place during the Great Depression to save people from foreclosure. So it was a housing program, a lending program created to save people from foreclosure. It was implemented through a racialized lens, and residential segregation was a requirement of the program. Same thing with FHA, which is why in the first 35 years of the FHA program, less than 2% of the loans that were originated under the FHA program went to people of color. So again, the thing I want you to take away is all of these laws, the National Highway Act, the Model Cities Act, Urban Renewal, all implemented through a racialized lens. Now, what's the problem? Well, we use race to create residential segregation in America. But what we have said to people is, going forward, right, during the 1960s and 70s, we passed a bevy of civil rights laws. And when we passed those civil rights laws in the 1960s and 70s, what we said was, going forward, you cannot consider race in a lending decision or a housing decision. So me as an individual, I cannot consider race or national origin when I am individually making a housing decision or a lending decision. But what we left in place was the structural inequity, the structural racism that had been permeating our society because of all of those laws that I showed you in the previous slide. So what we said was, yeah, the system of racism that has developed over these hundreds of years, we're not going to do anything about eliminating that. We're going to leave in place residential segregation. We're going to leave in place systemic disinvestment of communities of color. We're going to leave in place the racial wealth gap that we've created because of these racialized policies. All of these systems, we're going to leave in place educational segregation. We're going to leave all of that in place. So the systems we're going to leave in place, but we're going to tell individuals, when you're making an individual decision, you shouldn't be considering race. Well, as you well know, what that means is if the systems, if the apparatus is still in place, we're still perpetuating inequities and disparities from a race perspective. Ta-Nehisi Coates said very famously, with segregation comes the concentration of disadvantage. because you now set up a system, you now set up a scheme where you can use place-based remedies. You can use place-based solutions to decide who wins and who loses. If you're deciding where you're going to implement, where you're going to construct or develop a new sewer line, a brand new sewer line, well, you can decide we're going to put the brand new sewer line in the north, and you can make up some reason, some rationale as to why you're going to put the brand new sewer line in this part of town and not in this part of town. And as you can see, you make those kinds of decisions over and over and over again. And what we have built is a situation where you live, the space that you occupy, the space that you inhabit, now determines everything about you. Okay? You give me your address, I can tell you your credit score. You give me your address, you tell me where you live, I can tell you your educational attainment. I can tell you your chances, the chances of your child graduating from high school or attending college. You tell me where you live, I can tell you what kind of diseases you have. I can tell you how much net worth you have. I can tell you how long you're going to live if I have your address. Because now in America, because of these racialized policies and laws, place is inextricably linked to opportunity. Place cannot be disassociated with opportunity. So let's zero in on the financial services system. And let's look at our bifurcated or dual credit market in the United States. On the tan side, what you see here, this represents the fringe market, all right? On the blue side, what you see, this represents the mainstream financial market, okay? So on the blue side, you have your banks, you have your credit unions, you have Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, you have your AAA rated securities. So the mainstream financial services providers are there on that blue side. On the tan side, you have your fringe, your subprime lenders, your payday lenders, your buy here, pay here lenders, your title money lenders, your check cashers, your rent to own shops, etc. That's here on the tan side. And because of residential segregation, what we now have is this scenario where people of color disproportionately live in communities where the credit providers are those represented here in the tan space. Predominantly white communities, the credit providers that are existent in predominantly white communities are those who are here in the blue space. Now, let me tell you a little bit about these two spaces. On the blue side, what you see is this arrow that emanates from the consumer and goes up through all of these market players and then comes back down to the consumer. And what that means, what that is meant to represent is that when you access wealth in this blue space, it is the wealth or the credit is inuring to the benefit of the borrower, of the consumer, right? It's wealth building, it's equity creating. On this tan side, what you see is a real little arrow that goes from the community, right, back to the borrower, but the bigger arrow goes to the financial services players in this tan space. Because when you access credit in this tan space, it is equity stripping. It is wealth depleting. In fact, some payday lenders have a business model that is designed to push the consumer to the brink of default. They want you to go into delinquency so they can extract more fees from you. Now, you access credit in this blue space. What you have is a highly regulated system, right? The players in this market are highly regulated by the Federal Reserve, by the OCC, by the FDIC, and so forth, and by the CFPB, and so forth and so on. Not so much here. These credit providers are not regulated at all or very sparsely regulated. Okay. The other thing that I want to share with you is that when you access credit in the blue space and you pay your bills on time, so you make your obligated payments, that positive information is reported to the credit repositories so that people who are accessing credit in the blue space can build a good credit score. In the tan space, when you pay your obligation on time, that positive information is not reported to the credit repositories, which is why people who access credit in this tan space are disproportionately credit invisible. Now, in a very perverse arrangement, if you do not pay your debt obligation on time in this tan space, while the positive payments are not reported to the credit repositories, the negative payments are very likely reported to the credit repositories if they go to collection. And again, remember, the business model is to make you go to collection. And so that negative information is reported to the credit repositories. So if you're accessing space credit here and you pay on time, you're credit invisible. If you access credit here and you perform the way they want you to perform, you go delinquent, you become credit visible, but in a negative way. And this slide is just another example to illustrate how the service providers in that blue space that I showed you in the previous slide are not located in communities of color. So this is some research that was completed by Trulia and Zillow. They did this in conjunction with us for the 50th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act 2 years ago. And they did this for a number of geographies across the United States. And they looked at more than just the financial services space. So they looked at healthcare providers, they looked at food options, and they looked at whether or not people are living in healthy, clean environments. So they looked at a number of things, but one of the things that they also looked at is what are the financial services that you have access to based on where you live? And what they found is that in city after city, and I've just shown you here Detroit and Houston, but in city after city, African Americans and Latinos live in credit deserts, whereas our white brothers and sisters live in credit-rich spaces. So not only is there a dearth of banks and credit unions in communities of color, but that hole, that vacuum has been filled by those credit providers that you saw in the tan space. In fact, the Center for Responsible Lending did an analysis a few years back that showed that the #1 predictor of where a payday lender would be located is racial composition of the neighborhood. Now, many people will tell you that, oh, it's all about economics. Banks are not locating in communities of color because of an economic situation. It has nothing to do with race. It's all about economics. Not so. Right now, today, as I speak, banks are closing branches in high-income, affluent Black neighborhoods at a higher rate than they are closing branches in low-income communities of color. And again, what that means is that disproportionately African Americans, Latinos, people of color are disproportionately accessing credit outside of the financial mainstream. And that all is having an impact. It's all having an impact on how you show up in the traditional credit repository information. And it is all having an impact on the technology that is built using the data that is in the credit repositories. So we know that people of color, because of of what you've seen in this slide and the slides I've shown you before are disproportionately credit invisible, or when they show up in credit repository systems, they're disproportionately showing up as negative consumers of credit, right? Consumers who don't know how to utilize their credit very well. Now, the information that is not contained in the credit repository system is what were the terms and conditions of the credit that you got. And what we know from the subprime debacle, the foreclosure debacle, is that people who accessed credit from the subprime space were much more likely to go into default and foreclosure because of the terms and conditions of the loan, not because of any of the characteristics of the individual borrower. Yet, the information about what drives performance, what drives delinquency, is not contained in the credit repository systems. Do you see? And so unfortunately, because the data in the credit repository systems is easily accessible and cheap, we find that data modelers disproportionately use information from the credit repositories in order to build all of those different technological utilities that I showed you about a few slides earlier. Credit scoring systems, risk-based pricing systems, valuation systems, and so forth and so on. So how is technology manifesting bias? Let's talk about a couple of examples. Risk-based pricing systems. Berkeley, researchers at Berkeley did an analysis in which they looked at a very homogeneous book of business. So the book of business for this study are GSE loans. Those are loans that are backed by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Okay, so it's a very homogeneous book of business, all right? Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, it's a very pristine book of business. This is the creme de la creme, okay? And what they did is they looked at fintech loan originators and compared them to loan originators who really didn't rely on a lot of fintech, a lot of technology in order to make their decisioning. What they found was that for making the decision about whether or not a lender would lend to a consumer didn't really change that much between the fintech lenders or the lenders who didn't rely on a lot of technology. But what really did change was the pricing, right? So what they found is that African Americans and Latinos are surcharged by technology, by AI-based systems, from 5.6 to 8.6 basis points, right? So African Americans and Latinos are paying between 6 and 9% basis points higher on their costs to get credit than they should be, than what is their commensurate level of risk. It represented 11 to 17% higher profits for these fintech lenders, which translates to up to $750 billion each year in additional unfair costs. This is every single year. Every single year, African Americans and Latinos are paying almost $1 trillion more to access credit than what they should be. That's coming out of your net worth. That's coming out of the money you should be saving to send your children to college. That's coming out of the money that you should be saving for retirement. All of that wealth is being transferred from the pocketbooks, from the wallets of consumers of credit over to their creditors unfairly and unjustly because of the algorithmic strategic pricing. Now, why is this happening? We believe for a couple of reasons. One is many algorithms are keyed, their design, their purpose is to maximize the profit for the creditor. And so one of the considerations that we know credit design, technology designers take into consideration is how well a consumer shops for credit. Because we know from lots of research that consumers who do a lot of shopping for credit, they pay less. And the less shopping you do, the more you pay, right? So these algorithms can detect how well a consumer is shopping for credit. And if you're not shopping for credit that much, then the algorithm says, oh, you know what, this person isn't shopping that much, let's charge them more. The other thing that we think that the algorithm may be picking up on is how, whether or not a consumer has been willing in another transaction to pay more than their commensurate level of risk. So to pay more to access credit than they otherwise should have. And so if you're willing to pay more, for example, for your credit card debt, or pay more for your auto loan debt, then you should probably be willing to pay more for your mortgage debt. But what these systems don't pick up on, because they don't understand, because they're not, the designers aren't looking for it, and they don't include this kind of data into the development of the models, is the bias that already is existed in our marketplace, in our society. So let me give you this example. This is from an auto lending testing program that we did last year. So let me explain testing for some who don't understand testing. So in testing, in a testing scenario, what we do is we match up two consumers, and we match these two consumers up on every pertinent characteristic, except for the controlled basis for which we're testing. And in this particular instance, we were testing for race or national origin. So we matched the testers, we matched these two people. One person was white, one person was African American or Latino, right? Or Asian American, right? So we've got a white person matched to a person of color, and we're controlling for credit score, we're controlling for income, we're controlling for debt to income ratio, and so forth and so on. And in every single testing scenario, what we do is we match a less qualified white person with a better qualified person of color. So what should happen is in every single scenario, the person of color should get the best options. They should get the best pricing, right? Because they're better qualified. That's not what we found. 62.5% of the time, we found that the better qualified non-white tester received more costly pricing to the tune of an average of almost $2,700 over the life of the auto loan. 75% of the time, our white testers who were less qualified got offered more financing options than non-white testers. And this bias was manifest both intentionally and also subliminally, right? There was some implicit bias going on, but there was some intentional discrimination going on as well in each of these transactions. And so you can imagine that if an algorithm is considering one of these consumers of color who got treated worse, right? They got charged more, even though they were supposed to pay less. The algorithm can look at that and say, oh, okay, well, this person was willing to pay more for their auto loan, so I'll charge them more for the mortgage loan. Not understanding that the person wasn't willing to pay more for the auto loan, they got discriminated against, which is why they paid more for the auto loan. So bias can be manifest, right? It can be manifest in pricing systems if the systems are not designed appropriately. Let's take a look at advertising, and I'll run through this really quickly. So this is our case against Facebook. We sued Facebook a couple of years ago for discriminating against African Americans, Latinos, people with disabilities, women. They were discriminating on almost against every protected class under the fair housing laws. And one of the ways, not the only way, but one of the ways that the discrimination was being manifest was in the actual design of Facebook's advertising platform, right? So you're a housing provider, you're a lender, you're an insurance agent, you go on to Facebook's advertising platform, and this is what you see. So they ask you, do you want to target your ad so that only certain people can see your ad? And you say, yeah, I want to target. So you can target based on where people live. You can target based on age. You can target based on gender. Do you only want men to see? Do you only want women to see? Do you want to target based on language use? And then let's come down here. Now, this is the thing that really got me. You can exclude audiences based on race and ethnicity. And look at who you can exclude. You can exclude African Americans. You can exclude Hispanics. You can exclude all Hispanics. You can exclude bilingual Hispanics. You can exclude English-dominated Hispanics or Spanish-dominated Hispanics. So tell me who you cannot exclude. There's no category for white people. You can't exclude white people. Yeah, so even just in the design of the system can be designed to be fundamentally discriminatory and generate bias. Facebook had another program. This was their ads manager program, and so this was their lookalike program. And I'm not making this up. This is actually what it was. Your next customer looks just like your current customer, and this is the graphic that they decided to use. That's changed. That's all changed. That has all changed. One of the things in our settlement we did was to work with Facebook to redesign a new advertising platform for housing, employment, and credit ads. All right. So there's a whole brand new platform that Facebook's designers created for housing, employment, and credit ads, so that they could remove that discriminatory component and try to rebuild the system so that it generated more equitable outcomes for consumers. And if you want to go into more detail, just go to our website, nationalfairhousing.org, and you can see the components of the settlement. All right, I just got a couple of more minutes before we go to Q&A. Let me talk about facial recognition systems, widely known for generating bias. So this is an analysis that was done by a very, very famous data scientist, Joy Buolamwini from NIT, formerly with MIT. She looked at a number of facial recognition systems that had been developed by IBM, Google, and so for Facebook, and Amazon. So she looked at all of those facial recognition systems and analyzed them for their degree of bias. And what she found was that the systems misidentified white men 1% of the time. They misidentified white women 7% of the time. They misidentified men of color 12% of the time. And they misidentified women of color 35% of the time. That's a failing grade, right? And the reason is because these systems were built by using inferior and tainted data. And so if you're using inferior or tainted data in order to train your algorithmic system, then you're going to get tainted and biased results in the generation of the outcomes. So a couple of solutions. There are many, many different solutions, but I thought I'd tee up the most common ones that we're advocating now in a number of forums. So there are several different special committees that have been put in place in Congress in order to look at AI bias and fairness and AI ethics. One committee is being headed by Congressman Hurd, who is a Republican congressman from Georgia, and then Congresswoman Kelly, who is from Chicago, a Democrat from Chicago. So it's a bipartisan committee, and they've been doing a lot of great work. And they've invited us to be a part of the series of analyses that they're doing to look at this issue, to look at, what laws, how should the laws be changed to address this issue? What kind of regulations should be put in place? What kind of funding do we need to provide to take a look at how technologies are generating bias and harming consumers? So here are the solutions that we've been promoting in those forums, but other forums as well. So first, we need to dramatically, and when I say dramatically, I mean on steroids, increase diversity in the tech and financial services space. We have to. Just got an example of this the other day from an AI firm located out there in California that we do a lot of work with. I won't name names, but what they did, they hired a young woman. It's a really interesting story. I met this young woman at a conference, at a technology conference, a woman of color. She had just graduated, and she said to me, "Oh, I hear you talking about diversity in tech, and I'm looking for an opportunity, and I can't find a job." So I said, "Okay, well, let me put you in touch with these different companies." I put her in touch with Facebook, put her in touch with Google, and put her in touch with this firm. I guess I will say it because it's a great story. Zest AI, which is located in California. She interviewed with Zest and fell in love with them, and they hired her. So she's an African-American woman working for this AI firm. And she was looking at some of the data sets that AI developers traditionally use in order to build credit scoring systems and automated underwriting systems and so forth and so on, and to test for bias within the system. And she said, "You know what, this system, this data set, this methodology that we use for testing bias, it's not a good data set because I'm looking at my personal situation and the situation of my family members, and I can tell you that for me and most of my family, this system would not be able to detect that we're African American. I think I can build, because I'm Black and I kind of know what I do and I know what my family members do." She said, "I think I can build a better model." And that's what she's been working on. And I think she's going to release a paper very, very shortly. But see, if they didn't have a person of color working within their office, then nobody would have detected that this model that has been used, not just by them, but by all financial services institutions, by the CFPB, by all of the financial regulators, had this sort of fatal design flaw in it that was delivering false positives and false negatives when it comes to people of color. So we have to dramatically increase diversity. We have to train engineers and developers and coders about these issues, about civil rights issues, about tech bias, about the structural inequities that exist in our nation and why they exist. We have to utilize more robust and accurate and representative data. Our data sets are not representative at all. And so if you're starting with bad data, you're going to get bad results. We have to really increase networking between advocates and civil rights professionals and technologists, data scientists. We have to create more forums like the one that I was just talking about, so that we can have these intersectional, these cross-sectional discussions and help each other understand how bias is being manifested in technology. Have to increase fair housing and fair lending enforcement, which is why we have to keep disparate impact. We have to keep affirmatively furthering fair housing, do everything that you can to make sure that HUD does not implement a rule that takes away, right, our right to use disparate impact and to utilize affirmatively furthering fair housing. Because if we lose our fair housing protections, we're not going to be able to ensure that bias is removed from these systems. We have to insist on transparency and explainability. How, as a lender, how do you issue an adverse action notice when the technology you're using is generating bias and you don't know it? Well, you're not issuing an accurate adverse action notice, right? So we have to have better explainability in these models. Updating our regulatory guidance. I can tell you that Capitol Hill has not kept up. Our regulators have not kept up. They need to do a much better job. We need to use technology. We can actually use AI to detect bias and remove bias from these systems. So we can actually use AI as a laser to go in and identify where these discriminatory flares are happening and silence and mute them to the best that we can. Of course, addressing the structural bias and the structural discrimination that exists in our society, we have to do that, right? Because the more that we eliminate structural bias from the society, the more we're generating better data, right, that can be used to build these systems. Okay, so I'll stop there and turn it over to you, Rosalina, for Q&A.
Hi, thank you so much. This has been really, really interesting, and thank you so much for raising our level of awareness of a lot of these things that seem to be kind of happening behind the scenes. We have a couple questions here, and the first question that we had, I think you answered a little bit of it, so I'm just going to do a little twist to this question. The original question was, what steps are the creators of algorithms that have already been shown to be discriminatory doing to address discrimination? Is there a way to fix the algorithms? And so I guess my question would be, one, if you could answer that, and two, if there's any of those things that you would prioritize that you just discussed.
Oh, that's interesting. I wouldn't prioritize anything. I think we need to do them all simultaneously. You can't just do one without the other. And if we prioritize one, it's not, we're talking about incremental enhancements, not the huge systemic enhancements that we need to make in this area. So in terms of the first question about what are data modelers doing, what are technology developers doing, unfortunately, not much, which is why we need probably the legislative and regulatory fix.
Okay. Our second question here comes from Hannah. There are obviously many links between the zip code of someone's home and their overall financial well-being and access to resources. In the same context, have you noticed that housing and/or employment discrimination is also disproportionately impacted in these areas?
Yes, of course. So one of the things that I mentioned was the Urban Renewal Act and that list of laws, right? So what happened with the Urban Renewal Act and the Model Cities Act was government went in using a place-based analysis and obliterated economic districts all across the United States. In fact, people of color call the urban renewal program the urban removal program, right? Because literally government came in and tore down business districts that had been built up by people of color over centuries. It was a place-based implementation. And unfortunately, government did not replenish those economic hubs that were destroyed. It's one of the reasons that we have the systemic racial wealth gap in America.
All right, let's move on to our next question here. How are interracial couples impacted in these algorithms? If one of the members of the couple is white, do they both gain a benefit?
No, so no. So if one of the couples is white, do they both gain a benefit? No, not necessarily. You know, I think it's more situational. And of course, it depends on people's individual circumstances. So the algorithms, the technology is just manifesting. It's just manifesting human behavior, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we all have heard of the story. We all have, where, you know, you have one person in the couple who's white and one person who's black. The black person or the Latino person goes in to negotiate for the car or to negotiate for the house, and you get discriminated against. Then the white partner goes in, signs the Latino partner, and can get the best deal, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's the same thing gets manifest. That same thing happens in technology. But again, it's situational, right? It just depends. It could benefit or it may not benefit, right? It depends on what the technology is seeing and what it's picking up.
Okay. We have a testing question here. Is testing the best way to discover discrimination in these algorithms? How is a person supposed to know they have experienced discrimination from an AI algorithm?
Okay, that's a great question. So yes and no. Yes, we can use testing. And the auto lending testing project, if you go to our website and just put in the search engine auto lending, you'll see the study and the analysis. So you can use testing to pick up just some of the discriminatory outcomes, but testing will only get you so far. If you, for example, if you cannot conduct a full application lending testing program, and you're probably not going to see a whole lot. But if you can do full application lending testing program, lending testing, which is what we did in that auto lending project, then you probably can see a lot. Right. So remember, I said there was an intentional bias that we saw, but we also saw the hidden bias as well in that auto lending project. But the best way to detect bias in an algorithmic system is to use AI to go in and analyze, because see, AI has the ability, AI is not linear. It's multidimensional. So AI can see correlations that the human eye cannot see. AI can see correlations in the data and manifestations in the data that you can't see with a regression analysis, right? So actually the best way to see the bias is to use an AI system to go in and muddle around inside that formula, inside the model itself, and detect where the discriminatory flares are happening. And once you isolate where those discriminatory flares are happening, then you can silence them and mute them.
It's very interesting. We have a question here from Jody. I'm gonna unmute her here. 1 second. Oh, it looks like that may not be possible. Okay, do large corporations or organizations evidence a desire to work to eradicate this tech bias? You know, not that anyone would admit it outwardly, but I would imagine some corporations would prefer to keep these biases in. So I think she's trying to get like the mood of some of these larger corporations and organizations in now that they're more aware of these issues.
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. Yes, some companies do want to address it, and no, some don't. And then some may want to address it, but they can't figure out a way to do it. So one of the things that it's very, very hard for us to appreciate is that financial services companies, particularly if you're talking about a large financial services company, they have tons of technology that they've been using for decades, right? And oftentimes, these technologies are trying to interface with each other. So you have a loan origination system that's trying to interface with a sales or marketing system, that's trying to interface with a servicing system, that's trying to interface, you know, on the mortgage side, that's trying to interface with what other products that are being offered, auto lending or credit cards, right? You have all these different systems that are trying to be integrated and communicate with each other and work with each other. And so oftentimes what you got is just a hobbled mess, right?
Yeah.
And so here I am, here we are as civil rights activists, we're coming in and telling the companies, you need new technology to figure out where your systems are discriminating, so you can buy new technology to mute the discrimination. And sometimes what people are just saying is, wait just a second, I just got these systems to work. I literally just got these systems to work. I just got them to integrate with one another. I just got them to start talking to one another. It's not broke right now. I hear what you're saying, but I can't fix it right now. The next time something breaks, we'll try to fix it. And so, but then you have some companies who say, you know what? We don't care. We want to make the investment. We want to make it work. Unfortunately, those companies are few and far between, which is again why we need the regulation and the legislation to, you know, in some cases gently push, and in other cases strongly push companies to do it because it's important, right?
Yeah.
You're talking about affecting literally millions of people's lives. This is really important.
Absolutely. We have a question here from Stefan. I'm gonna unmute you here. Hi, can you hear us? Okay, well, I'll go ahead and ask your question for you, which I think is a really good one. What are some policy suggestions or solutions at the local level that you would recommend to break the zip code outcome gap?
Right, so there is a component of the Fair Housing Act called affirmatively furthering fair housing. What it requires is that any jurisdiction who is receiving federal funds for a housing or community development purpose, it requires jurisdictions to use that money in a way that is affirmatively furthering fair housing. And a component of that is jurisdictions are supposed to work with all of you in order to identify barriers to fair housing and develop solutions. So if you're finding that consumers do not have access to credit, if you're finding that bank branches are not located in communities of color, right? One of the things that jurisdictions can do is say to lenders is, if you want our business, if you want to be able to issue our bonds, if you want to handle our financial accounts, you're going to have to step up your fair housing and fair lending game. You're going to have to make sure that you're providing credit to all consumers in this jurisdiction or in the state. So if you want to continue to make millions of dollars from issuing our bonds, then you're going to have to affirmatively further fair housing.
And I think we have our last question here from Maria. So let me see if I can unmute you, Maria. Hi, Maria, can you hear us?
I don't hear anything.
Okay. For some reason, we're having some issues here, but she wants to know how, as an individual, she can help to change and make equality more likely for all.
Oh, that's a wonderful question. Some of us have the ability to, because of our jobs, we have the ability to make sure, for example, that our jurisdictions are actively engaged in the affirmatively furthering fair housing process. But if that's not your job, you can reach out to your jurisdiction, you can reach out to your local fair housing organization to find out when that process is happening and attend the hearings, attend the meetings. You can amplify these issues on social media. You can call your congressman. You can call your senator. Right now, we have the HEROES Act that was just passed by the House of Representatives, and it contains a lot of the equity-driven solutions that we need to put in place. A lot of these solutions have been developed with a fair housing lens, but the Senate is blocking it. So call your senator and tell your senator, we want to see the HEROES Act passed. There are different things. You don't have to be, a civil rights activist in order to help make a difference. You can just use your voice to help amplify the positive things that need to happen.
Thank you so much. I love ending on this action plan note. Thank you once again.
Thank you, Rosalina.
And I want to thank both of you. And oh my gosh, Lisa, I'm so sorry we're not doing this in person because the room would be roaring right now. This is
Yes.
that's something that we're missing. That was a marvelous presentation, and that clearly you could do a whole college course, not just an hour on this topic. So thank you for being here and for elevating this discussion. With that, we're ready to move on, but I do want to ask people to remember to join the conversation on social media. If you heard things you really were fascinated by, tweet it out. Use the hashtags here, SDRAFFH2020 and FHDigitalAge, to join us in discussing material covered today. I think it's just really amazing, moving, and so timely. And so thank you again to Lisa for the presentation, and Rosalina for facilitating that. With that, we're going to keep this rolling. So if you have to take your breaks, take your breaks. We're going to keep the program rolling. We're going to have Kevin Stein, the Deputy Director of the California Reinvestment Coalition, or CRC. And at CRC, Kevin leads corporate and policy campaigns. He advocates for regulatory and legislative change, works in partnership with local community organizations, and conducts action research. And before coming to CRC, Kevin was supervising attorney at the East Palo Alto Community Law Project and lecturer in law at Stanford Law School. Kevin is a graduate of the Georgetown University Law Center and Stanford University. Helping to moderate this portion of the program is Laura Nunn, who is the very esteemed Director of Policy and Programs here at the San Diego Housing Federation. And with that, I'd like to welcome Kevin Stein to the stage. Kevin?
Hi, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, great. Let me see if I can get you to see me. Maybe this is for the best. Somebody knew something.
Very
okay,
good,
great.
Kevin. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Great to be with everyone. I, of course, wish I could be with you all and we could all be together. I do hope everybody is healthy and feeling well, and that goes for you and your colleagues and your clients and your constituents and your communities. Thanks very much to the Alliance for Fair Housing for inviting me, and for the Housing Federation and Legal Aid Society and all the partners. I really appreciate it, and I hope you'll bear with me as I try and navigate the new format. As I was trying to figure out how to unmute myself, I saw that my boss was calling me. So one mini crisis averted, I guess. You do have to look at me, I suppose, but maybe that's a victory of sorts for me, having figured that out. I do hope that in the next little bit of time we spend together, I can share with you some of the work that my organization has been doing that relates to fair housing and fair lending. Hopefully it builds off of some of the great presentation that Lisa gave. I'm always happy to hear Lisa Rice and to hear more about the great work that the National Fair Housing Alliance is doing. And I think in sharing with you some of our work, you'll hear some challenges that we're facing, you'll hear some successes that we've had, and I hope to identify some opportunities for advocacy. So I also really appreciate Lisa kind of winding up the presentation with a focus on advocacy and what we can all do, because that's kind of what CRC is about. Let's see if I can advance the slide. Oh, great. Okay, a little too far. So what I will hope to cover, just to give you a sense of where we're going. First, talk about a particular fair housing CRA success story, doing business with the mob. So I should tell you that I'm mainly hopeful that you will find some meaning in the next 40 minutes or so, and that's my desire. But sometimes I do things just for me. So if these seem like inside jokes to myself, hopefully you'll forgive me. I may spend a bit of time on that and then move towards the second item, leaving his mark. It's not hip to be square, and a little discrimination is okay, which is going to be about a very timely and concerning issue of the CRA being under attack. Next, I'll talk a bit about small businesses. I know this is a fair housing conference, but there's a lot of related concerns and issues in the small business context, and that's an issue that we work on. Hopefully we'll have some time to talk about displacement and some of the anti-displacement work that we're doing. And then to wrap up and tell you kind of where we are now with COVID and our organizational response to the crisis. Okay, a bit about CRC. We are a statewide advocacy coalition. We have about 300 nonprofit organizational members. We have some public agencies who participate with us. And I guess one thing I want to highlight is, if any of what you hear is of interest to you and you want to, you may be a CRC member but are not working very closely with us, or you're not a CRC member and you wish to, I really would encourage you to reach out, because to the extent that we are successful in our efforts, it's because we have a strong membership base. So we're stronger together for sure. Our mission, as you see here, is to build an inclusive and fair economy that meets the needs of communities of color and low-income communities by ensuring that banks and other corporations invest in a just and equitable manner in our communities. So much of our work historically has been focused on banks and financial institutions, though not exclusively. And our membership is comprised of organizations that are probably represented by those of you who are participating on the call. We have a number of fair housing councils in the state that are part of our coalition. We have housing counseling agencies, consumer credit counseling agencies, as I say, a few public agencies. We have groups that work with small business, legal service providers, organizing groups, community development financial institutions, et cetera, groups that build affordable housing. And a lot of our work does relate to the Community Reinvestment Act. And that picture was a picture of a few of us. We had some folks inside heading into one of our bank meetings that was actually a meeting with JP Morgan Chase in Oakland. I think it was our last meeting before COVID. So first I want to talk about a success story. Just trying to keep track of time. So this was a long campaign, and if people have heard me talk before, I've probably talked about this campaign. I'll try not to say very much about it here. It's hard for me because it took a lot of our effort. It took a lot of our members' involvement. It raised a lot of issues, but we think we reached a good resolution. And when I say we, I think CRC, I think our members, I think the community, and I think and hopefully the bank feels so itself. So this is a picture from 2015 where we had organized to protest the merger of One West Bank and CIT. It was a proposed merger at that time. We had come to be concerned about One West Bank due to its foreclosure activity. We were doing housing counseling surveys for a number of years during the foreclosure crisis, and some of you may have participated. And One West Bank, though not the biggest servicer of mortgage loans, was one of the worst as identified by the counselors. This merger came along, and the more we kind of looked into the practices of the bank, the more concerned we became. We wound up protesting the merger, and we realized that a lot of our concerns were related to the disparate impact of the bank's practices on communities of color. And as a result, and we filed our first HUD redlining complaint. We filed a complaint with the Department of Housing and Urban Development, alleging that the bank was engaged in redlining practices because its branch presence substantially excluded neighborhoods of color. And this is the map that you see here, a map that was, we got some assistance from the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, and the yellow goldish areas are where neighborhoods of color are in the greater LA area. The red dots are the One West branches. So you can see they somewhat ring the neighborhoods of color. And as a result, the other aspect of our complaint was, in addition to branches, lending was not happening in neighborhoods of color. And that's what the green dots here represent, that the lending was kind of, along the lines of where the branches were, not in underserved neighborhoods of color. One West Bank has been in 6 counties in Southern California, including San Diego. So we focused on LA where they have the biggest presence, but they're also in San Diego. And one of the things we plotted, it took some effort to collect the data, was the ratio of foreclosures by this bank in neighborhoods of color compared to mortgages. And so you'll see the red bar represents foreclosure activity in neighborhoods of color in California, compared to the much smaller blue bars representing mortgages made. All told, over this 6-year period, we found that the bank was 9 times as likely to foreclose in a neighborhood of color as to make a home loan. So that's shocking. Some numbers for foreclosures per county. So if you see that red line for San Diego County, for the 2 kind of affiliates of One West Bank, the total of foreclosures was 2,323, which does not include an additional 187 foreclosures from another affiliate of the bank, Financial Freedom, which did reverse mortgages. So these are foreclosures on seniors and their families. I mentioned, and by the way, that's the quickest I've ever talked about this merger. So this is the success part. So we had filed that complaint with HUD. We did negotiate a settlement agreement with CIT. Along the left line here, you see the key terms of the settlement. And again, this affects San Diego County and as well as other counties in Southern California. So if people are working with homeowners in particular, hopefully you know about the settlement and actually would be interested if you did or did not, if you've heard from the bank. But please note some of these key terms that we think are important. So for one, the bank agreed to open a branch within the 6 counties that's in a low-income neighborhood and a neighborhood of color. I think suggested by Lisa's presentation, banks are moving away from opening branches because of technology. So they're saying, well, everyone can use online banking. We don't need to have branches. Branches are important for neighborhoods. So we were really pleased with this. We urged the bank to offer and market FHA loans, which have a bit of a mixed history, I guess. are a main way in which people of color access home ownership. There are some concerns with the product, but we think if you're not offering an FHA product, you're not trying to serve a broad array of the community. So we think it's important that the bank agreed to offer FHA loans. And we had some discussion about ways in which they can address some of the concerns around FHA, that it's a little costlier, and maybe if people are entitled to less expensive conventional loans, they should have access. So there's some good faith effort on the part of the bank to kind of make options available, make options known to their borrowers. The bank agreed to do ITIN lending for borrowers who may not have social security numbers, really important issue for us. They agreed to offer loans with no minimum loan amounts. They have tended to make larger loans, so this was an important issue for us. They agreed to translate certain documents into Spanish and to provide interpretation services for borrowers who speak various languages to get assistance. Over $1 million to market the terms of the settlement in neighborhoods of color and conduct outreach. $1 million to community-based organizations, including to help us develop an economic health promotora program to provide greater access to immigrant communities. And then here are the bigger numbers. So the bank agreed to originate $100 million in lending in neighborhoods of color in these 6 counties where their branches are, including San Diego, and to help facilitate that, to create a subsidy fund of $5 million. So for borrowers who are kind of on the edge of being able to afford home ownership, the subsidy fund is meant to kind of get them over the line. And there are certain restrictions on the subsidy fund so that it's not a whole lot of money to any one person. That for sure, we're talking about people who are living in their homes. We're not talking about investors. That we're talking about loans that are conforming loans, not jumbo loans. So I did get, so I'm going to try and highlight things for people maybe to take note of and for potential follow-up. If you're working on these issues, my understanding, so it's relatively new, the settlement, and CIT is rolling things out. The subsidy fund in particular is newer. There is not yet, I believe, an applicant from San Diego. So let's make sure San Diego benefits from the settlement. And if people want to talk with the bank further, you have customers, clients. There's a gentleman named Arnold Simon. So I think it's okay for me to mention his name. Arnold.Simon@CIT.com can be helpful. The settlement, we felt good about. We were, it wasn't everything we wanted. We were addressing our specific allegations around redlining, so it wasn't all of the issues that were presented. But we had an opportunity soon after the settlement to address some of the other issues, because CIT called us, which doesn't always happen, but called us to tell us that they were looking to acquire another bank, the Mutual of Omaha Bank. So, which actually, this is not me, this Mutual of Omaha Bank apparently called itself MOB, M-O-B for short. So we thought we might have some fun with that, but even better, we entered into a CRA community benefits agreement with CIT, which we think is really a win for communities, including in San Diego. And some of the terms are here, and I will just kind of quickly note them. So it's for California, where CIT is really focused in terms of its branch presence. The bank is committing $6.5 billion over 4 years for community development purposes. So that includes single-family lending, multifamily lending, small business lending, community development lending for affordable housing and investments to CDFIs, and $25 million in contributions. So that's a lot of reinvestment. And, when I was listening to Lisa, she had that really interesting slide with the bifurcated financial system. In a way, I was thinking, well, maybe CRA is like taking the mainstream financial institution and trying to get it to reach over into the LMI community and to bring that wealth building resource and capital to LMI communities that otherwise are stuck with fringe, high cost, wealth depleting financial providers. So that in that context, maybe this makes some additional sense, this kind of effort. Other things that the bank agreed to during this process was to open another branch in an LMI neighborhood, a neighborhood of color. This is a bit technical, but was really important to us, and maybe unfortunately will become more relevant going forward. H4 is our very strong homeowner bill of rights. Maybe some of you helped us work with us a few years ago to pass that foreclosure protection for homeowners. One West Bank had been arguing they didn't need to comply due to complicated legal reasons, preemption. And we thought that was a weak argument, but they were making it, and they've agreed to stop making it. So we applaud them for that. They agreed to discuss with us our platform around fighting the financing of displacement, which maybe we'll have time to talk to in a bit. And they agreed to meet with us to give us updates, and they already have been around their implementation of the redlining settlement, as well as the implementation of the CRA agreement. So two very positive developments relating to CIT within the last several months. So moving on, so that was a good example of CRA working. CRA, if we were together, I would ask people like how many of you know about the CRA. It could be that all of you do. It could be that very few of you do. Most people in the country have never heard of it. But it is the nation's anti-redlining law. So kind of, as you're hearing about Lisa talk about the history of disinvestment and harm in communities, the CRA is intended to address that by creating an affirmative obligation on the part of banks to lend and invest and help meet local community credit needs. The CRA, unfortunately, is under severe attack. As we are sitting here, I received a note that one of the banking regulators is there's rumor that they may make an announcement tomorrow, which could be an announcement that they have finalized a rule that we think will substantially weaken the Community Reinvestment Act. So it's been a long process of fighting the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, one of the banking regulators. This is the regulator for the national banks, which tend to include some of the larger financial institutions like a Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Chase, etc. And so they had issued an advance notice of proposed rulemaking, and then they issued a notice of proposed rulemaking. They had promised that they were going to finalize the rule within the first half of the year, and there's rumors that they might report out tomorrow a final rule. There is so much to say about this rule and how harmful it would be for communities. I started to list a number of things here. I won't get into them in the interest of time, but just broadly speaking, so just a couple of minutes on CRA. If CRA is, let's say, a three-legged stool of a focus on low and moderate income people and communities, a focus on meeting local community credit needs, and to facilitate all this, the participation of the public to inform what are the local needs, what do we need banks to do, and to also to shine a light and say, if banks are not doing a good job, to point that out and to kind of ideally pave the way, show the way to a better horizon. With the proposal as expected, we haven't seen what the final rule would be, but the proposal would seriously kind of cut out the legs underneath this three-legged stool by weakening all three components, and doing so in a way, we're at a fair housing conference, doing so in a way that we think will disproportionately impact neighborhoods of color. Maybe to just pick one, it's hard to pick. Like Lisa, I like how Lisa didn't want to choose what to prioritize. This is not a prioritization, but since the framing of the discussion today is around technology and algorithms, I will point out, do not have to be square, in part because I like that. I came up with that one. If anyone in my office tells you otherwise, you say, no, Kevin, I heard Kevin came up with that. We oppose, if people know Square, you go into a small business and you use your credit card and they have a Square on their computer, and that takes your information. It probably knows who you are. It knows everything about the business because it's been tracking all their transactions. Square is also a small business lender, and Square, a year and a half ago, applied to become a bank. So we opposed the bank charter on a number of grounds, including it didn't have a good plan for community reinvestment. We suspected they were charging people too much, and they wouldn't tell us how much they were charging their customers. We asked, what are the APRs? They wouldn't tell us. And we had generalized concerns around fair lending and are the algorithms discriminating? Not that we had particular evidence about Square, but just in general, I wanted to get some comfort that they had a process in place. The CRA proposal mostly proposes to do harm, in our view. In this one instance, they oppose to address the problem of a Square bank that has no branches and has no real clear reinvestment obligation where it's doing business. But they did so in kind of an unsatisfactory way. But in the framing of this proposal, the OCC kept saying, well, we're just updating the CRA. It's been so long since it's been updated. We need to update it. We need to modernize it. And I think this was the main provision that they were focusing on, which, when asked, well, how many banks are we talking about here are going to be affected by this increased reinvestment obligation due to modernization? The comptroller was reportedly said he didn't know, but maybe it was about 10. So that doesn't seem like a proper framing of a proposal that we expect will do substantial damage. One of the things I was going to ask folks to consider, because I know there are a number of representatives of local government, and local government should be very concerned about this because CRA is private dollars, right? This is banks reinvesting in the community in ways that are good for the bank. They're making loans that are going to get repaid. They're investing in the community. This is not public money, but it's going to serve a purpose that could be viewed as a public purpose and help building wealth for residents and for communities. And to the extent that the proposed rule that comes out undercuts that, as we suspect it will substantially, that's going to fall on the local governments because the needs in the community will be greater, and maybe people will be looking to the public funds to kind of fill in the gap of any loss of bank reinvestment funds. One of the things I was going to suggest is that people work with local governments, or maybe the Reinvestment Task Force wants to do a resolution expressing concern about what's happening. There may be time to do that. There may not be. But if people are interested, you can let me know and we can discuss it, because we think it would be important if the city or county of San Diego said, we think this is the wrong direction. And maybe we're, like Lisa said, maybe we're going to move our money. We're not going to do business with banks that don't uphold the same standards, that don't abide by the existing reinvestment standards. that would send a strong message. I'm going to keep moving in the interest of time, but do know that people are concerned that the proposal, if it's finalized in anything like the form we saw it, will lead to redlining. There's a concern that we will have more redlining and less bank reinvestment as a result of this proposal. The National Community Reinvestment Coalition tracked all the comments coming in through this process and found that 83% of them were against the proposal, supportive of a strong CRA. 1% were in favor of this proposal. And yet the regulators are proceeding during a pandemic. They're during this crisis when the needs of communities are going to be greater and the needs for reinvestment are going to be greater. They're proposing to undermine CRA. So we will see what happens, and we will fight as we can. And if you're interested, please let us know. So the question is like, why? Why would they do this? It must be based on data. No, there's no data that they have shared that supports their position. And the WHO, the comptroller of the currency, is the CEO of the bank that I started talking about with the slides on the branches not being in neighborhoods of color and the foreclosures far exceeding mortgages in neighborhoods of color. The bank was very, in our view and analysis, poor at reinvesting in the community, did little small business lending. Its branches in low-income neighborhoods were half that of all the industry, looking at the industry as a whole, and we saw about foreclosures far exceeding mortgages. And then this was one quote. The comptroller makes some interesting quotes. This was one. If a bank wants to open a branch, close a branch, or make an acquisition, certain community groups know how to hold you hostage during that process, and they use your lack of compliance in between the reviews in order to be able to do that. It's interesting that the focus seems to be on a concern about accountability for financial institutions, when I think we would hope that our regulators would be more focused on the lack of compliance. But this is the situation that we're in. Moving quickly, but making a bit of a transition to small business lending. One of the things in the CRA proposal is it would, in general, it's going to result in banks, we think, doing less to serve the communities that we are all concerned about. One specific example of how this will happen is with small businesses, which are encouraged, tracked for their lending to small businesses in loan amounts of under $1 million, or to businesses with revenues under $1 million. It's doubled the thresholds, so that currently 95% of businesses are below this CRA threshold, and yet they're raising the threshold, I guess, for the other 5% in a system that they've designed that encourages higher loan amounts and higher investment amounts. So the business of the banks is going to gravitate to the largest businesses and move further away from the small businesses. Shifting gears a bit, small businesses suffer in a number of ways, including there's a lack of transparency around who is being served by small business lending generally. With mortgages, you saw that earlier chart where it could show where the lending was occurring. We have data on home mortgage lending by race, by ethnicity, by census tract. No such thing exists for small businesses, and our members that work with small businesses have been, wanting that for decades. Coming out of the foreclosure crisis in the Dodd-Frank Act, Congress created a provision, Section 1071, urging the CFPB to develop a rule for small business data collection. It hasn't been done. So CRC and some of our partners actually sued the CFPB. This is another victory and opportunity. We sued the CFPB. We need the small business data, and We settled with CFPB recently, so they are going to finally begin a process of developing a rule. The opportunity here is we're going to need to comment, and we're going to need to really create a record that we need all business transactions covered. We need all lending covered. We need to see the terms, as Lisa was saying, not just whether a loan is made, which is super important, but what are the terms of the loan and who is making it. I'll give one quick, and I'm going to summarize because I realize that I'm going way over, but I'll give a little San Diego anecdote. So we met with regulators in San Diego a few years ago to talk about small business lending. We invited a number of small business owners to tell their story. And I think all 11 of them, if I'm remembering right, we had 11 small businesses that we just kind of, picked. All 11 of them had taken out what sounded like merchant cash advance loans from online lenders. So consistent with the theme of the conference, people couldn't get access to bank loans. They went to these online lenders and they all regretted it. They all got in over their heads. That's the kind of data we need to be captured by 1071. We're seeing it now with the federal relief under the PPP program, which people may have heard about. It's gotten a lot of attention. The system, the relief set up by Congress was to funnel small business support through banks who historically have not served small businesses in neighborhoods of color, owned by people of color, owned by women. And what did banks do? Banks started taking that money and lending to their existing customers in a way that essentially reinforced redlining. The system, through people saying, hey, this isn't quite right, the system, the process has been revised a bit so that it's getting better, but it's a sad statement of how, those most impacted by all the crises tend to get the least relief. So there you have it. I would just mention that one of our big campaigns is around the financing of displacement, that banks have been making loans to bad landlords, speculators, Wall Street firms, private equity, and we think that needs to stop. We've done a couple of reports, including with the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, where we noted a large number of financial institutions involved. We had targeted First Republic Bank as being particularly bad based on anecdotes and data. The reason this is important is because it has a clear, at least in our experience, disparate impact. The people, banks are making loans to people buying buildings, knowing that they're going to raise the rent, knowing that the people living there are not going to be able to stay and afford the increased rent. And those people tend to be people of color disproportionately. So in this slide, 100% of the 40 tenants represented by the Legal Service Office were protected groups under the Fair Housing Act, where their eviction was foreseeable. We've developed a set of best practices we call the Code of Conduct. That one thing for you all, if you're interested, we're asking groups to endorse it. We have over 100 groups that have endorsed. We're trying to get banks to sign on. We're trying to get it codified into legislation. And I will move us, this is my last slide. We're working on a number of things, and I'm sorry to kind of be rushed through everything. One of the things that we really want to make sure we don't do is repeat the mistakes of the past, where neighborhoods of color were disproportionately impacted, first redlined, then overcome by subprime loans, overcome by foreclosures, never quite saw the foreclosure relief, the loan modifications, and then the properties were sold to Wall Street firms, real estate investment trusts. We need to avoid that. There was a bill that was heard today, AB 250101, by Chair Limon. It passed out of the committee today. We're trying to support that bill, to strengthen that bill amidst very strong industry opposition, to say, keep people in their homes, both homeowners and tenants. Also keep mom and pop landlords and affordable housing developers, let them have access to relief. So if they're having a hard time paying their mortgages, but let's create a mechanism so that when foreclosures come, and they will, that we don't see these properties go into the hands of the speculative market. Let's create a process that gives people who want to live in those homes the first chance, community land trusts and affordable housing developers who want to keep the housing as affordable and a benefit to the community, give them the first chance to buy. So people are interested in that. It's alive. I didn't know if it would be. We'll keep pushing on it. With that, I will again thank you so much for your time. Apologies for being a bit rushed. And we'll understand if there's no time for questions. But I do thank you for advancing the slide. Yes, that's my email, kstein@calreinvest.org. Love to hear from people if you're interested in any of this. And thanks for the work that you all are doing.
Great. Laura, do you want to pick up some questions?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Kevin. That was very interesting. A lot of information to pack into a short amount of time. Regarding questions we have coming in, we just have a comment from Daisy Crompton, who's with the Reinvestment Task Force here in San Diego, and she mentioned that she has seen a story, breaking news, that Joseph Otting is expected to step down this week after completing an overhaul of the rules governing CRA. And so maybe some things are changing around that. It sounds like it's a pretty rapidly evolving situation. I was hoping, can you go back, is it possible to go back to your slide on CRC's strategic plan? And maybe we can just quickly kind of touch on the CRA rulemaking as it relates to your strategic goal around creating and preserving affordable housing in California. And maybe we can just kind of dig in a little bit deeper for a couple of minutes before we head over to our next speaker.
Sure. So first of all, thanks to Daisy for the work that she does. The Reinvestment Task Force did submit a letter on CRA, which was really important. And the co-chairs of the Reinvestment Task Force signed a letter that we put together saying, don't proceed with this rulemaking in the midst of a crisis when people don't have time to read through a long rule, comment, and we don't have the capacity to deal with a weakening of CRA. So thank you for that. Our housing efforts, so I'll say this, we are, as a membership organization, we look to our members to help us define our agenda. And so if people want to help us define our agenda, please join us and do so. I believe we're scheduling a housing webinar in the next couple of weeks. So if people are interested in that, let me know. We had spent a lot of time in the foreclosure crisis. During the foreclosure crisis, we were trying to keep people in their homes. And coming out of that, we've tried to figure out how can we better support affordable housing. Our niche has been our relationships or our advocacy with financial institutions. And so we're always interested to leverage that however we can. We've looked to groups like the Housing Federation to inform us as to what are important policies we need to support. We recently supported a letter that a bunch of the groups advocated around increasing rental subsidies and support for affordable housing developers and for preservation. I think a lot of our work that we've generated around affordable housing has been around this anti-displacement financing program to redirect, which really has two pieces. It's saying for financial institutions that haven't thought much of it, do additional due diligence to ensure that when you're lending to this person who's going to buy a 20-unit building with tenants, that you're not underwriting the loan to increased rents. You're not assuming rents are going to go up. You're not lending to someone who you know has a model of getting rid of people, because then as many affordable housing units as can be created is undermined by all the naturally occurring units that we lose because people get evicted. So that's part of it. And the other part of it is we're mostly talking to banks who have CRA responsibilities. So re-energize your efforts to support affordable housing. And we are always, this is an open invitation for any nonprofit housing developer or any community-based organization. If you're having problems with a financial institution, where you're having challenges in general with financial institutions, we want to hear it, and we want to figure out if we can work with you on the solution.
Great, thank you. We did actually have one question pop in, Justin from Legal Aid. And Justin, I'm going to see if I can unmute you, if you'll just stand by. Let's see if we can get this to work.
And just to Daisy's point quickly, which I forgot to address. So I just saw while Lisa was talking, that there's going to be a big announcement from the OCC tomorrow. So my thought was they're going to finalize the rule. Maybe it will, the comptroller's deciding to step down. That would be a better outcome.
Gotcha. Justin just informed me that he doesn't have a mic, which is very understandable. But his question is, with the attacks on the CRA, how important are local credit unions in making sure that there's still local credit sources available? Or to put it another way, do local credit unions make a substantial impact in keeping local credit options available?
That's a really good question. A lot of people wonder about the credit unions. Credit unions they're not subject to CRA. So we think they should be. We're not sure that credit unions are always better than financial institutions. They tend to do less harm, right? So banks in general can do a lot of harm, and they also can do a lot of good by reinvesting. It's like, which is the left hand and the right hand. And credit unions tend to do less damage, I think. And maybe they're trying to support their communities, but we're not sure that they lend better. They may. We're particularly supportive of community development credit unions and community development banks that and credit unions that have a mission to serve the community, not the community of their members necessarily, but a community that is otherwise not being well served by mainstream financial institutions. And the credit unions tend to lobby against all the bills that we that we think they always want to be exempt from any obligations. Maybe I'm sure they would think for good reason, but it's a point of contention.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Well, I think that's all we have by way of questions, and we appreciate so much your time and your presentation today. That was, again, a lot of information, but really interesting and certainly very, very timely. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. And again, we were in a live room, you would be hearing the thunderous applause. I mean, this is a really enthusiastic group, and you spoke very much to the issues of concern to this community. So thank you for taking the time. And I wish we'll have you back. We'll have you back. With more time.
Thank you. Thank you.
With that, with thanks to Kevin, I want to remind folks to keep the social media posts coming. We've enjoyed engaging with you using all the hashtags SDRAFFH, which stands for San Diego Regional Alliance for Fair Housing 2020, and FH Digital Age, Fair Housing the Digital Age. So please use those hashtags. Our final speaker today is going to be Branden Butler, the Assistant Deputy Director of the California Department of Fair Employment and Housing. And prior to DFEH, Branden was the Senior Attorney at the Fair Housing Center of the Legal Aid Society of San Diego, where for 9 years he was instrumental in creating the first fair housing program at LASSD. Branden has litigated fair housing cases on a broad range of issues, as well as led numerous broad-based fair housing education campaigns. Branden was president of the San Diego Regional Alliance for Fair Housing from 2016 to 2019, where he successfully led the effort in creating this very conference, this Regional Fair Housing Education Conference, and we've been pleased to collaborate over the years, and now to have you as a special guest. And Laura Nunn will be helping us with moderating. So if there's questions between she and I, we'll be moderating it. But with that, let's give a big digital hand to Branden Butler. Thank you, Branden.
Well, thank you, Steve. It's a pleasure, and I want to thank everyone at SDRAFF and the San Diego Housing Federation for putting on another wonderful event and continuing the tradition of providing education on fair housing to everyone here in San Diego and beyond. And I also want to thank the other presenters who had a wonderful presentation, Lisa Rice and Kevin Stein. Greatly appreciated their presentation. And thank you to everyone. I'm sorry, as everyone said, we can't be here together in person. I was greatly looking forward to it. But of course, we are in a pandemic and in a state of emergency. So, this is where we find ourselves. But nonetheless, it's still important to continue our fair housing education. And again, I'm Branden Butler. I'm the assistant deputy, and I'm going to, today talk a little bit about where do we go from here, what was the subject of the panel. And I'm going to talk about literally like where do we go from here in light of COVID-19 and some of the issues related around there. But I'm going to spend the bulk of my time today talking about, how big data and algorithms play a part in this question of discrimination against folks with a past criminal conviction that can disproportionately lie on race. So we're going to talk about that and kind of that conundrum and what are some resources and what does the law say. So that will be our discussion today. And so I'm going to go ahead here and change slides here. Let's make sure we're ready to roll. Okay, great. So yes, I'm with DFVH, and the Department of Fair Employment and Housing is California's civil rights agency. So we do work for you, and we're honored to do that. And yes, we are open right now. Although our offices are closed, we are continuing to take fair housing cases and the like. And if you don't know DFVH, our mission is really to protect the people of California from unlawful discrimination in employment, which is a great deal of our work, as well as in housing and public accommodations, and for the perpetration of acts of hate, violence, and human trafficking. And let me also just mention that hate violence is a concern right now. During the pandemic, we've seen a great uptick in acts of hate violence against Asian American community. So something we're working on, and we have more resources on that. But just want to highlight that that is an issue today. And if you don't know DFVH, our general responsibilities, is we do this type of work of engaging the public in outreach and technical assistance to talk about, the laws and how we can assist. But we also investigate all the discrimination complaints that are filed with our Office for Housing Discrimination, including systemic discrimination. So we are that entity. We facilitate mediation resolution of cases and disputes involving civil rights. We have a mediation division. And we enforce laws by going to civil court. We are a law enforcement entity in that regard, and that we will enforce the fair housing laws on behalf of the state of California. So just as we build up in, I'm just going to move through this, but I want to make sure we're all on the same page. Some of the civil rights laws we enforce at the department. One that we're going to be talking about here today is going to be the Fair Employment and Housing Act, which you can find at Government Code. The housing portion is 12955. And what this really is our bread and butter fair housing laws that protect, folks in California from discrimination on the basis of any protected characteristic. We'll talk a little bit about the Ralph Civil Rights Act, which prevents hate violence on the basis of a protected characteristic, which I mentioned has been an issue, has always been an issue, but even more so in light of COVID, there has been acts of hate violence. And even recently I saw, unfortunately, in San Diego County, folks wearing Ku Klux Klan hats and Nazi masks at the grocery store. So we continue to see acts of intimidation and hate violence here, even locally, as well as I was aware of some graffiti and Allied Gardens around the Chinese community, which is unfortunate, but just a point of emphasis that these acts of hate violence are not a relic of the past. Another law that everyone should know, and it comes up in housing quite often, is the Unruh Civil Rights Act. This protects individuals from discrimination and harassment by business establishments, but generally, as many of the fair housing practitioners know, the Unruh Civil Rights Act covers housing discrimination as well. So it's kind of another law around housing discrimination to be aware of. And not going to talk too much about the Disabled Persons Act, but we cover that. And just as a heads up, we do cover human trafficking, protecting individuals against deprivation or violation of their personal liberty in terms of forced labor or including sex. And then also, and it relates to fair housing, is we also cover discrimination around anyone receiving state funding. So this could include housing providers who receive state funding. But if there's discrimination going on within the program, this would be a violation of the government code. 11135. So just a little background of our civil rights laws. Now, let's talk about fair housing. So I had originally intended, of course, it was Fair Housing Month in April, and wanted to highlight, 52 years since the passage of the Federal Fair Housing Act, shortly after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. And so I wanted to just make a mention of that it still is a significant and important milestone and one of the most important civil rights laws in our country. But often untold and not as well known is California's fair housing laws, which actually predate the Federal Fair Housing Act, coming along in 1963 as California's Rumsfeld Fair Housing Act. And as many folks may know, unfortunately, after California passed our first fair housing law, it was repealed by a popular vote 1 year later, and then reinstated by the California Supreme Court. And through that time, again, a difficult time when it was repealed, we've seen expansion and progression of California fair housing laws. I will talk today a little bit about our new fair housing regulations, which provide some specific protections and guidance around how housing providers should be working with folks with criminal history background, and how that can actually be discriminatory on the basis of race. And we've also expanded, our protected classes, including a new amended definition of source of income, which includes housing subsidies and housing assistance, which again will be very relevant as we emerge from the COVID crisis. There will be new forms of federal and local assistance. And now that we have a law that prevents that type of discrimination, this will help, hopefully, in easing the crisis. So just as, again, a bit of background as we get in our discussion, we're going to run through what are the protected bases, protected characteristics, in California. And, of course, California fair housing laws encompasses all the federal protected classes, including, the federal 7, but we add some additional protected classes. I won't run through everything, but I, want to mention one that, new expanded definition of race in California this year under FEHA, meaning it includes hair texture and hairstyles historically associated with race, which means it is now going to be unlawful, a race discrimination to say I'm not going to, rent to someone who has cornrows, or I'm going to treat someone differently because they wear their hair in twists or braids, or et cetera. That will now be race discrimination. So I want to highlight that. I also want to highlight, as we wait for the Supreme Court to announce a decision on Title VII, Employment Civil Rights Act, with regard to will sexual orientation, identity, and expression be protected under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. In California, the law does not change no matter what the Supreme Court says. You are protected in California. The LGBTQ+ community is protected from housing discrimination, despite what will happen at the federal level. And additionally, of course, again, I mentioned the source of income is now a state law. I know in the city of San Diego, there's a source of income law, local, but this is the new state law, which provides protections on the basis of housing subsidy or housing assistance. And just a couple of other points as I go through. Just want to always highlight as well that primary language, immigration status, age, and citizenship are also covered under our UNRRA Civil Rights Act, which applies to most housing accommodations in California. So that's also a protected basis to mention as we get in our discussion. And I think, as many folks know, just to clarify though, who has to comply with these laws? It's really, all types of housing providers, and, landlords, homeowners, real estate agents, sellers, builders, lenders, et cetera, Airbnb type platforms, the list goes on. And we're going to talk a little bit later about, well, where do credit reporting agencies fall? And, I think we're going to follow that they are covered as they act as an agent of the landlord. So I said just to mention a few things about COVID, and I just, we've produced some guidance on our DFEH website around fair housing issues related to COVID-19. And this is a document I put together, and I just want to go over a couple of brief highlights, because I do think when we talk about where we're going from here, I literally think how do we go from here with regard to COVID-19, and what could be discriminatory? What are some emerging issues as we get back into renting properties and back into the rental market with larger masses? What are some issues to be aware of? What are some things to cover? So I just want to touch upon that, because it kind of fit within our theme today. So one thing I just want to again point out that because we did see discrimination against our Asian American community, that of course it is unlawful for any type of discrimination or treating a tenant less favorably than another tenant because of their race or national origin. So whether we're refusing to rent or segregate or provide less favorable terms, including people you're associated with, someone you're cohabitating with who is Asian American and is facing discrimination related to COVID-19. All of that is covered within our fair housing laws. And in addition, I also want to point out that harassment is covered under our fair housing laws, including even when it's done by another tenant. And we have this kind of tenant on one tenant, third party harassing another tenant on the basis of their protected characteristic. So again, applying it to the COVID situation, if someone's being harassed because of their race, national origin, disability, etc., by another tenant, if the housing provider is aware, should have been aware of the discrimination, and refused to promptly correct the harassing conduct, this will be a violation of our fair housing laws for the housing provider. Now, I also want to mention that I think the biggest issue when we get to COVID-19 and kind of where do we go from here is, is this discrimination against persons with disabilities? If I have COVID or I'm suffering the symptoms of COVID, am I disabled? Can I be protected? And I think the answer, which we have in our FAQ where you can find all of this, is that, that COVID-19 can lead to a disability. A diagnosis in and of itself may not meet that definition, but certainly many of the, results of having COVID-19 would be disabling. Inpatient healthcare, if you have to continue medical treatment, supervision by healthcare provider, pneumonia, the list goes on. So I think it's a fairly kind of low standard when we think of the serious impact of COVID-19, that many folks who are diagnosed and have symptoms will meet this definition of disability. And that's important because when we talk about housing discrimination and doing it on a protected basis, if I have a disability and you're telling me you won't rent to me, I have to be segregated on another side of the building or something else, this can be a disability-based discrimination. And so I think as we go forward, this is going to be an emerging issue, whether folks have some type of antibody and they receive more favorable treatment than someone who hasn't had it, or someone who perceives as having more symptoms of COVID-19, even though they don't have it. This can be disability discrimination. And similar to the AIDS crisis in the early 80s, someone can be disabled even if they are not disabled at all, but they're perceived that way. And so I think, when we think about COVID-19, that's another issue that comes up, is the perception of being disabled and what kind of treatment will you receive on that basis. So again, another issue, where do we go from here? I think there'll be issues to be watching out for the disability community and folks associated. And I also want to just mention that age is a protected basis in California, and just want to highlight again that we allegations of folks being treated differently on the basis of being an older adult, being singled out by a housing provider, being told they have to stay in a certain area, differential treatment on the basis of their age is also an emerging issue and something to be thinking about as we emerge from this COVID. That while a housing provider could require all tenants to abide by local, state, and federal public health orders, we can't segregate and discriminate against someone on the basis of their age, saying, you can't live here because I think you're likely to get COVID, or you would have a more serious reaction, so maybe you should go somewhere else. That is discrimination. So I want to just highlight some of these emerging issues as where do we go from here. And I'm just going to, say a quick mention again. Where do we go from here in terms of, the kind of eviction process in California? Know that there's a lot of work happening behind the scenes to find both long-term and short-term solutions. But I think, as many folks on the call know, and as many cities are doing many different, different types of protections for renters. But know that at the state level, the Judicial Council has, made it so that eviction should not be proceeding until 90 days after the emergency order is lifted, and that is a to be determined date. All right, so I want to turn attention now to the question of criminal history, having a criminal history background, and how the interplay of big data and the algorithms, which Lisa so eloquently talked about, as well as Kevin, both play into this question of, is there a discrimination issue here with big data and how it's running the rental screening process for folks with a past criminal history? So per HUD's notice in 2016 around criminal history protections or guidance on some level, in California as in the rest of the nation, African American, Hispanics, and certain other groups face higher rates of arrest, conviction, and incarceration than the general population. The use of criminal history information in housing decisions can therefore have a disproportionate negative effect on these protected groups. Now, we're talking about discriminatory effects or a federal law disparate impact. And we don't have a lot of time to go into this, but it's the idea that you could have a neutral policy of, I'm just going to screen everyone for a criminal history background. But is there a disproportionate impact on a distinct protected group that could be done in a less discriminatory manner? In our regulations, you really outline how that less discriminatory manner should be occurring for folks with criminal history. So we're going to walk through that and relate it to big data. And again, just to get this idea of the impact of neutral policies around, basically saying, I won't rent to someone with a criminal history record, again, across all age groups, the imprisonment rate for African American males is almost 6 times greater than for white males. And for Hispanic males, it is twice that of non-Hispanic white males. And this comes from, HUD's 2016 General Counsel guidance on the application of the Fair Housing Act standards to real estate related transactions. So we have the data already that due to mass incarceration and disproportionate policing and justice that we have now, many other reasons, we found ourselves in the situation where we are now disproportionately incarcerating people of color. So therefore, if we have a preference of not renting to someone with a past criminal history, we are having a distinct impact on people of color and communities of color. So this is kind of the backdrop of this discussion. And then on top of that, we know that 95% of inmates will be released at some point. And last I checked, we have, just a little less than 2 million people in prison. So folks are going to be coming out. And how do we have rental housing policies that will allow folks to have a fair chance at renting a property despite their criminal history? What way can we devise to make sure that there's a fair opportunity? And I think the state regulations reach that we'll talk about. But the other kind of, where do we go from here is that we know folks are being released from prison early right now due to COVID-19. And in many cases, there's been massive outbreaks of COVID-19 in prisons around the country. So folks have been getting released to try to prevent that. And as folks get released, we're also going to have to figure out where folks are going to live. So, the new, Fair Employment and Housing regulations, which were developed by DFEH, has a kind of regulatory rulemaking body called the Fair Employment and Housing Council. And after several years, they put together regulations which really provide what I like to call the meat on the bones of our fair housing laws. So we have our fair housing laws, but now we have regulations which help interpret them and provide more guidance. And in the regulations, not in the law, but in the regulations, there's a great deal of discussion on how criminal history information can be used and how it can be used in a discriminatory way. And so that's kind of what we're going to talk about and relate it to big data. So, some of these questions that come up is, can the housing provider just ban everyone with, certain felony convictions? They're not eligible for rent. What are the rules? So, broadly, you'll find our regulations here at the California Code of Regulations, and we're really starting from sections 12264. And in a nutshell, it prohibits the practices that violate or require others to violate, the provisions of the regulations relating to criminal history. Some of those violations, are such as having a blanket ban, saying I will never rent to anyone with any criminal record whatsoever, no matter where it happened. Now, there are regulations that interpret when we can use criminal history information, which is allowed, but we can't blanket ban folks. And so you can imagine if you have a third-party system that's running the screening tenants for criminal history backgrounds, and they're just blanket banning folks who have a felony background, this would be not in compliance with our regulations, as well as in the screening process for a tenant, a background check should not be considering arrests, juvenile records, sealed records, diversion programs, and other expungements and other types of records. And on our website, we have produced an FAQ that goes in great detail, walking down what are the, what do the regulations say about screening for criminal history. So I refer you there for kind of all the ins and outs, but we're going to walk through a couple of them and then relate it back. So, again, under our FEHA regulations, it's made, very clear that, housing providers cannot make any statements indicating a blanket ban on renting to anyone with a criminal record. The law prohibits advertisements and screening policies, oral, written, or statements with blanket bans such as no felonies or no, we don't allow criminals here. However, it is not unlawful for a housing provider to advertise or state that it will run a lawful criminal history check, right? Because you can still do a criminal history check subject to some of the caveats we're saying here, but you can't just ban anyone no matter when it happened, because again, based on the data that we have, these types of rules would have a disproportionate impact on communities of color, thereby exacerbating the segregation and concentration of poverty that that Lisa and others were talking about today. Now, this relates to our discussion because if we understand that we can't have blanket bans and there are some rules and contours to how we should be running a criminal history background check for a tenant with a past criminal history record, we're going to run up against the question of, well, what are these third-party, algorithm companies doing, and how do they, comply with these regulations? So think of that in your head. But basically, in our guidance, we say that, rental housing applicants should expect a housing provider to consider their particular circumstances, which could mean delaying a background check until after they decide whether the applicant is qualified to rent. And it can also mean letting the applicant know in writing that they're concerned about a conviction and giving the applicant a chance to explain why they would be a good tenant. That's hard to do on an automated program. This can include a chance to show, a housing provider background report is actually wrong. So we've had, a case from time to time where the criminal history background report is wrong. It's saying someone was convicted of a felony, but actually it wasn't a felony, it was a misdemeanor, or perhaps it's the wrong person. It could also be the chance to show information about the circumstances of the applicant's crime, like how old they were, whether the crime was related to a disability or domestic grounds where they were a victim. And essentially, in a nutshell, what our regulations are getting to is that if we understand that policies that would, kind of ban folks who have a past criminal history will have a discriminatory effect on the basis of race and national origin, then we'll have a violation unless we can, find a way to do this criminal history check in a less discriminatory way. So some of those ways to say, I'm in compliance with the law, I'm just doing a criminal history background check in the kind of the least amount of discriminatory way would be, looking at mitigating information. So if a conviction does pop up, whether the individual is a minor or a young adult at the time of the conduct, whether the amount of time that has passed since the date of the conviction. Was it 5 years ago? Was it longer? Was it last year? Evidence that the individual has maintained a good tenant history before and after the conviction. Mitigating information can also include evidence of rehabilitation efforts, including a person's satisfactory compliance with all the terms and conditions of parole and probation, successful completion of parole, or mandatory supervision, et cetera, and whether they received a certificate of rehabilitation, et cetera. The point here being that mitigating information should be used by the housing provider when they have a criminal history background policy to ensure that they're not having a discriminatory impact when they have their policy. So if you follow these steps, it's more likely that the policy is not discriminatory. And again, whether the conduct arose from an individual's status as survivor of domestic violence, another mitigating factor, whether it was related to disability, the conviction, and other relevant factors. So we have this background then under our regulations, which say blanket bans are out. We need to kind of look to see what happened in the situation, provide folks an opportunity to provide mitigating information, and then make a decision. Under the employment side of DFH, we have this law, it's called Ban the Box, which prevents employers from asking about someone's past criminal conviction at the application stage, and then once an offer of employment is made, then the background check can be made. And the applicant's allowed to provide mitigating information. This is a similar type of framework. So with that understanding, now the question is, okay, I understand that there's some protections and we need to ensure that folks have a chance to provide mitigating information. Well, how does it work with a third-party company that the landlord has outsourced to run the criminal history background check and provide an up or down, a thumbs up or thumbs down on whether we should rent to the applicant? So, as we say in our regulations, it is not a defense for a housing provider to have relied on a third party's criminal history report if the use of the report violates fair housing laws. Housing providers that rely on criminal history, such as consumer reporting agencies, may wish to see them from the third party any details on criminal records discovered, so that the housing provider can make an individualized assessment. So this idea being that, okay, you can use the third party, data conglomeration, but the housing provider is still going to have to do the individualized assessment, is going to need to, obtain or look at the mitigating information, and that the third party credit reporting agency or, rental screening company, it won't be a defense to say that, the housing provider relied upon them. They just, they're based in Mississippi and they just ran a report and they didn't follow California law. So this gives us a little idea into the window of big data that while we know it's happening, while we know that big data is aggregating all kinds of data to give us an answer with regard to renting to tenants or not, this question really comes forth with the idea of, how can these agencies do this individualized assessment if they're not involving the housing provider? So I think a case that really, so again, how does this work from the new credit reporting agencies, the rental screening companies? So they're out there collecting all kinds of public data, including missed rental payments, including criminal history records, arrest records, when folks have been convicted, all kinds of data that is publicly available. And then many of these companies have a proprietary method of calculating how they're going to use that data to make a recommendation whether the housing provider should accept the tenant or not. They do an assessment, then there's a decision, and the companies really don't share how the information is weighted, what was involved in the assessment, and how the decision was made with no mitigating information. Now, I'm not speaking to all companies, but this is the concern, is how does that company provide this information to ensure it's in compliance? And I think a case that, while not here in California, I think illustrates the issue, and it is based on the Federal Fair Housing Act and guidance from HUD in 2016, is the Arroyo versus CoreLogic and the Connecticut Fair Housing Center that also was involved in the case. And looking at this case, because I think it's very, very helpful. And I know folks at the National Housing Law Project were involved and many folks in the fair housing community. But as a nutshell, this case was about in 2016. Mother, Carmen Arroyo, submitted a rental application to move her son, Mikhail, out of a nursing home and into her apartment, right? So she's trying to move her son in. He's in a nursing home. He has a disability. And he was in the nursing home recovering from an accident that left him unable to walk, talk, or care for himself. And essentially, her son was rejected because CrimSafe, which is owned by CoreLogic and is a rental screening program that runs criminal background checks and makes a determination, said that he had a disqualifying criminal record. And I just want to read from the case to give you an idea of what CrimSafe is and what it does. It says, CrimSafe uses an algorithm to interpret an applicant's criminal record and provide housing providers with a decision on whether the applicant qualifies for housing. And it's an automated tool that interprets criminal records and notifies leasing staff when criminal records are found that do not meet the criteria established for the community. So, so here you have a situation where a housing provider is setting criteria. I'm not sure if it's in compliance with the federal or state law, and then CrimSafe or company programs like this are giving a determination without an individualized assessment, or at least is where it was in 2016. So that's kind of the background, and then a few more facts. CoreLogic failed to provide the housing provider with any documents or explanation of their determination, and unlawfully refused to provide Ms. Roy with copies of the background report. As a result of the denial, the son had to remain in the nursing home for more than a year longer than necessary. Ms. Roy later learned that her son's only criminal record was a charge from prior to his accident, and was later dropped for shoplifting, an infraction below the level of misdemeanor. And so I think what core logic in this case is getting to that although rental decisions have traditionally been made by housing providers, today many landlords contract with third-party tenant screeners to make admission decisions for them. Now there are some different programs that will do a background check and then we'll send it back to the housing provider to let them make an individualized assessment. But just in the review of popular rental screening programs that are used, some are like CrimSafe it evaluates criminal records, providing really up-to-date information. There's also some that look at arrests and look at other criminal records, and so I'm not sure how all that is tailored per state, because again in California we can't look at arrests in making a rental housing decision. But this is the concern, this is the issue of how do we make those decisions with the third party? Are they aware of the regulatory overlay? And and I think what the core logic case, one of the holdings of the case, so to speak, and is relevant to our discussion is that the third party company who's providing this report may be vicariously liable for the discriminatory housing practice. And just to kind of explain what's that, basically a person is vicariously liable for a discriminatory housing practice by the person's agent or employee, regardless of whether the person knew or should have known of the conduct that resulted in the discriminatory housing practice consistent with agency law. Now that's a HUD reg, and it basically says, look, if a housing provider has an agent working for them, such as a tenant screening company, and the tenant screening company is not following the law with regard to running criminal history background report, the housing provider may be vicariously liable for the actions of the third party company. So this is also an important point in this case, and it would be similar under California law, under our regulations, and because again in our California fair employment and housing regulations, vicarious liability is a form of responsibility that makes a person liable for the discriminatory housing practice of a third party, regardless of whether the person knew or should have known of the conduct by the third party that resulted in the discriminatory housing practice. A person covered by these regulations is vicariously liable for the discriminatory practice by their agent, employee, regardless of whether they knew or should have known of the conduct, unless California agency law requires a different outcome that is not in conflict with the Federal Fair Housing Act. So again, getting to this idea that, if we walk down the road, we understand there's some baseline protections and guidance for running criminal history background reports. We understand that third-party companies are using, the big data, pulling all kinds of, information to make a decision. And we know that the housing provider will be liable for the acts of the credit reporting agency. We kind of asked the question now of, well, how do the automated criminal background checks with computer-generated scores and decisions perform this assessment? How does it work? Housing providers who use criminal background checks in their admission process generally must be prepared to conduct an individualized assessment of applicants with potentially disqualifying convictions. So this is where I think the concern comes up with big data, which is we have a new regulatory scheme that kind of walks through how this should work, but are these automated programs doing it? I don't know, but it would seem very difficult if it's just an automated thumbs up, thumbs down, and there was no information sent to the housing provider, and there was no opportunity to present mitigating information. And I think other questions that arise from this is, can tenant screening computers be programmed to apply standard rental admission criteria to criminal records, data appearing in an applicant's background check? I don't know. We heard about you could have put certain criteria on there, and then it would do it. The program would do its thing. But again, I still think that's not really what the regs are interpreting, because there's a lesser discriminatory way to run a background check, which is to outline what we've outlined in our FAQ: opportunity to provide mitigating information, being made aware that's a potential a conviction that could bar you from housing. And again, another question I think that comes out of the Arroyo case is, can we automated criminal background checks with computer-generated scores and decisions be programmed to evaluate whether an offense bears a meaningful relationship to housing, right? Because if a conviction has nothing to do with their relationship to housing, then that conviction should have no bearing, right? So when we look at convictions that may bar someone from rental housing, we have to first decide that point. Does it bear any rational relationship to what they're doing? Is there any evidence, as we point out on the slide, any evidence of rehabilitation maturity, education, or other changed circumstances which significantly reduces the likelihood of an offense being repeated, or other factors that may be related to criminal history admission decisions. So, I mean, so to kind of just make my point here, that we understand that there's this, new process of providing information to housing providers, but how does that big data comply with existing law? And will those programs have a disparate effect, a discriminatory impact on communities of color if we have a preference to renting to folks without a criminal history and there's no way to know how things are weighted or any opportunity to present mitigating information? So I think that's one area that we've been trying to do a lot in the space around providing fair housing information and guidance for folks with criminal history backgrounds, because folks are getting out, and folks are getting out of prison, and then they're getting they're locked up, and then when they get out, they're locked out of housing. So it's a repeating cycle. And I think just kind of other emerging issues that I would just kind of similar to what we discussed is, again, housing providers, even small housing providers, are able to now report information to the credit reporting agencies. So so many are able to report mispayments. They're able to provide successful payments. But who's being reported? Is it across the board, the same way, or is it certain communities of color where there's a high concentration of poverty are subject to it? I don't know, but I'm just relaying that I think these are emerging issues that are going to be coming up of how is big data used, and is it disproportionately used, and how can we measure it, especially in the rental screening process? So with that, I'll just leave kind of with a quote in research that I thought that was very interesting is, is that seemingly objective models trained on historical data is going to reflect and exacerbate historic discrimination and bias, as what Lisa brought up. And the fact that certain groups have not historically had ready access to safe and responsible credit could incorrectly predict that people in those groups are high credit risk. It can be hard to break the traditional credit system if you have historically been excluded, which is just another issue that we could get into in terms of access to credit and how folks are able to get housing if they've been historically excluded. So with that, I know we are pretty much out of time. I will just, I know you have access to the slides, so I'm just flashing through resources. So I appreciate you. I thank everyone, thank all the presenters and organizers, Estella, Rosalina, Stephen, and Lauren, and the whole crew. It's been a pleasure, and I'll take any questions and then be ready to salute everyone out.
Okay, and Laura, you're here as well. Well, first of all, let me thank Branden for just first of all for initiating this conference as those years ago, and for the partnership along the years. And I'll hand it off to Laura with any questions that we may have.
We had no questions come through from our attendees, but something that I kind of was wondering about as you were presenting, Branden, is for an individual who is seeking housing and is denied housing, is there a way for them to know whether or not a third-party screener came across information that might not be accurate, as was the case in the Arroyo case? Like, how would a resident or a potential tenant know if they've been discriminated based on data?
Well, I think that's the real challenge, and I think it's not uncommon in all housing discrimination to how do you know when it's actually been because of your protected bases in this situation? How do you know it's been because of big data and what the credit reporting agency said? That's a hard question. I mean, the Arroyo case had a specific fact where they were told and they requested information, they didn't get it. I think that for all folks in the rental housing process, if there is a denial, I mean, we would hope that based on our guidance that housing providers are alerting folks to, we found something on your record, this is the concern. But as you figured out, if no one says anything and you have no idea, and they just say, forget it, that's where it's really hard. And that's where testing, and that's where kind of the deeper investigation from all the fair housing groups doing so much great work is how we can ultimately get there. But I think the first step is raising awareness that, as of January 1st, we now have a set of regulations which provide guidance here, and there's actually a violation of the law if it doesn't happen. We didn't have that prior. it was there, but you had to prove it through facts and data. Now we can point to the regulations and say, you just banned everyone. So where we see it in writing is obviously the easiest way, right? Where someone just has a policy of, we don't rent to anyone with a felony, period. That would be one way, but I agree with you in terms of how do we find it? That's still the difficult question that will require the work of fair housing groups and folks reporting issues, maybe something said, maybe something found, but still an ongoing issue.
I think it just kind of, it reminds me kind of, you know, bringing this thread through from Lisa to Kevin to you of that there are challenges that are really systematic in nature, and that those are what need to be addressed in order to really continue to advance fair housing, and especially in this environment that we're in now, in this digital age where it's in a whole new world, a whole new platform than what the lawmakers were thinking about back when the Fair Housing Act was passed. It's a whole new world, right? So it's definitely I think the work continues, and that these conversations like today are so important to raising those issues and continuing to press those questions and think about what those systemic and structural changes are that we need. So just a little comment to add there to you know, kind of thinking of everything that we've heard of today, and you know, what's happening with the Community Reinvestment Act, which is such an important tool at the federal level, and how uncertain that is, but then how much the state is really working, and your department is working at that level to address these issues. So a lot of work being done and a lot of work to do.
Yeah, no, so true. And the only thing I'll say is at least we do have regulations now which provide some of the meat and context to maybe help do this additional enforcement and education, which prior to this, we didn't have it. So hopefully all the advocates and attorneys and folks in the crowd will use these resources to help be the long arm of fair housing enforcement.
Well, so talking about being resources, may we post all of these slides from your presentation today?
Yeah, and post them. And then also I would just point folks to our website where we actually have released in the last week or so, you know, FAQ guidance on screening for folks with a criminal history background. So I would tell everyone to take a look and please review those resources, because I think they will be helpful for both housing providers and the tenant community on what do the regulations say.
Great. Knowledge is power, and that's why we're doing this today.
Yeah.
So once again, let me thank Branden for your presentation today, for all the work that you're doing in this area. Slides for everyone who is a participant in the webinar. There will be an email going out tomorrow, so it'll be a link. There'll be a link to the materials from today. And with that, I want to thank you one last time, Branden, for all that you are doing, and for some closing words from the president of San Diego Regional Alliance for Fair Housing. I'd like to once again introduce Stella de los Rios. Branden, thank you, and again, sound of virtual applause.
Yes, thank you, Stephen. And I'm sure that if we were in person, it would be a big round of applause for all our presenters. On behalf of San Diego Regional Alliance and Fair Housing and myself, I'd like to thank all of our speakers today for enriching us with their knowledge and expertise. A special acknowledgement to our sponsors for this event. I want to equally thank those of you who took time out of your busy schedules. We sincerely appreciate your participation. Together, let's make our own contribution to ending housing discrimination and ensure that all people have an equal opportunity to find a place to live without the fear of discrimination due to factors beyond their control. Let us resist injustice, speak up and speak out, and let us have the courage to stand up against discrimination and fight back. I have no doubt that by your presence today, you are all prepared to address fair housing and the inequities that we are challenged with. Fair and affordable housing is a basic right for all communities. Let us walk hand in hand, work tirelessly, and continue Dr. Martin Luther King's legacy and vision for fair housing for all. Again, thank you, and please remember, take the time to fill out the survey. Thank you very much again.
Great, thank you, everybody. That is the conclusion of our program today. Please fill out the survey. once again, thank our sponsors, and we look forward to seeing other programs, other activities here in San Diego. So be well, be safe, and thank you for all the work that you are doing. We're going to stay here and monitor questions. If you have some last-minute questions, my team will be here for a few minutes more. And so until folks have signed off, we're going to hang around just to make sure your questions are answered. So I thank you again. Be well. Folks are asking where the survey is. You should be getting an email. When you close out, it should send you an automated email with the survey. Reading these things in real time here. Thank you for the kind comments. Thank you to our team. Raquel, you're a rock star. Great. Thank you for all the kind comments. And again, be well. Thank you. And we will see you, I hope, in person soon. Okay. Bye-bye.